So good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. In the back of the room? Yes? Okay. So today I'm going to talk with you about the topic that we find very, very exciting. So I work for Swiss Re, a reinsurance company. And I sit in our behavioral research unit, where we basically do a lot of testing with our clients, which are naturally insurance companies. But before I go ahead and I start, I'm going to ask how many of you have heard of behavioral economics in general before, by a show of hands? Okay, so it seems like we need a quick introduction to some of these concepts as well. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to give you a few main points about what behavioral science is and why is it that we care about it. And then I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of testing that we have done and how we think that this concept can be further applied to the insurance industry in general. So to start, I'd like to go back to the idea of classical economics. So I was trained as an economist. And if any of you have gone through the same kind of training, you can probably relate. And if you think back to your school days, you remember that a lot of the assumptions that we have when we do modeling in classical economic theory are around the fact that human beings in general are rational. When we go about making any decision, when we want to make a choice, we want to maximize our utility. That's kind of a funny way of describing something, maximize utility. This basically means that we want to pay the least amount of money to get the most value for something. And also classical economic theory says that human beings, so every one of us, is quite selfish. So we don't really care about other people around us. We want to be okay. We want to maximize our own utility. And like that, that's how the economy keeps moving. Behavioral science comes to this from a different perspective. And we say, okay, that's a very nice set of assumptions, but is that really true? Is it really true that people are rational all of the time? Is it really true that people read all the information you've given them when they choose an insurance policy? Is it really true that people have unlimited amounts of brain power and they are like these supercomputers who can process everything all the time? Not really true. Furthermore, we believe that in order to understand this behavior, we should actually do a lot of testing. So it's one thing when you ask people what they want to do through surveys and focus groups and things like that, but a better way to understand what is it that people want and do is to actually observe them in the real world through real testing. And this is exactly what we do at Swiss Re. We apply these insights to the insurance industry, and we go to anywhere in the process from the moment you start designing a product, so when you start gathering the underwriting information, to the point when you sell a product, and also in the retention and claims process. So back to the main points of behavioral science. So I like to show this little picture, and this is a very well-known kind of optical illusion. So if you look at these light gray circles in these two pictures, I bet that many of you believe that they are of a different size, even if you've seen this picture before. A way to help understand that actually they are of the same size is for me to change the context naturally. So if I draw two parallel lines, all of a sudden you see that yes, they are of the same size. If I take it away, the illusion comes back, although I just told you. So this is quite fascinating. Why is it that our brain keeps going back to this optical illusion? And okay, if it's visual, we can draw the parallel lines and it goes away. But what about when you have to deal with mental processes and concepts? You can't draw parallel lines in your brain, right? And I like to show a different example. So this game is called the Ultimatum Game and is one of the things you study in economics. And it goes like this. You have player A and player B. Player A has $10, and they have to offer something, at least something, to player B. Player B can either say yes or no, and that's the end of the game. There's no more rounds. If player B says yes, they both keep the money and they go away. If player B says no, nobody gets anything at all. So if this person has $10, what is the most rational offer that they should make to the second person? And I'm going to take some guesses. You have any takers? Yes? 5. Okay? 5. Anything else? 3. Okay. Right. So actually, you're all wrong. The most rational thing that player A should do is offer 1 cent. Because 1 cent is better than 0 in every rational case. And if player B is a truly rational person, they should say, thank you very much. Surely some money is better than no money, so I'm really happy, and we're both winning. Okay. So I was a very good student in school, and I did my reading before I went to class, and then we were asked to play this game, and it went like this. So this is me. So I was playing with my colleague, and I said, I have $10, so here's 1 cent. Please take it, because you're a rational person. And you can imagine that the reaction was something more along these lines, which is the usual case in the real world. Because as we had here in the room, the suggestions, people actually want to receive something more like $5. And we know that the moment you go below $3 or $4 or $3, people start saying no. Again, this behavior is completely irrational. It doesn't make any sense at all, because you should be happy to receive something rather than nothing at all. And this is a really nice way to illustrate that, in fact, people are not rational. Okay, so what does this mean? What does this mean for the real world? Do we see any repercussions in what we have around us? And the answer is yes. And they actually tend to be quite serious. And why is it that people are like this? So we have a very nice way of describing this, and this was a framework proposed by Daniel Kahneman. And he says that the human brain has like a psychodrama between 2 characters at play all the time. And when we do most of our thinking on a day-to-day basis, we don't think very much. So we have this so-called System 1 that's like a background operating system which is in charge. So if I ask you, don't tell me what the answer to this question is, I think that's very difficult. And if I would say 6 or something, you would say I'm crazy, because you know that the answer is 4. That's super easy. You don't even know why you know. It's just there. But if I show you something like this and I tell you, please don't tell me what the answer to this question is, I think you have a very difficult time, even thinking of what could it possibly be, 300, 500, 1,000, that's really difficult. And this is an example of where the System 2 type of thinking has to come in and help you. So either you take out your iPhone, which is probably most of you would do, or you take out a pen and paper and you have to go through the slow kind of thinking process to get to this answer. So can't help ourselves. Okay, so System 1, System 2. Which one is in charge most of the time? System 1, because we like to save energy. That also means that we tend to be a little bit lazy. So when we see something that it's quite obvious, we use mental shortcuts, we choose the easier option, and that can result in irrational behaviors some of the time, because we go with what is already there. And here's a wonderful example of what we see in the real world, as I was mentioning earlier. So what we have here is 2 very different sets of countries, and what happens with organ donations in these countries. So in these ones over here, nearly 100% of the population is registered as an organ donor. In the other countries, at most, you have 30%. So what's going on? If people are rational, is it that these people are getting paid for it? Is it that they have more information? Or is it that these people are really mean? They don't really care about society? We don't really know. The answer is very simple. So what happens is when you go get a driver's license, in these countries, you are already registered as an organ donor. So the way the form looks, you would have to click a box and say, no, I do not want to be one. In the other set of countries here is the same form, but people are not registered by default. So they would have, again, to click a box and say, I would like to be one. I would like to be an organ donor. So what happens is that behavior tends to be similar in both sets of countries, so people just don't click the box. However, so in both sets of countries, people are lazy, they accept the status quo, and they go with whatever was already chosen for them. But the result is a huge difference. So if I were to draw a conclusion from this kind of example, is that it's really, really difficult to change people's minds and what they believe and what they're going to do. That applies to insurance as well. But it's much easier to change the context in which people will make decisions. How do you ask a question? How do you design a form? How do you collect your information? This can have a huge effect on how people end up behaving in the end. A second example that I really like to show has to do with the future and how people think of that information. So in this example, a set of people, just like you, were attending a conference a week from now. And they were asked, so during the break, which is in 30 minutes, I think, you're going to have to choose between a healthy dessert and something like a cake. Can you please let us know what you would like, because we have to make sure to order enough of each. So people thought about it, and they were like, okay, so healthy, not healthy, what should I do? Let's focus on the cake. And roughly 50% said, I'm going to have the cake, I already know. However, when the time came, all the stuff was on the table. People could just go do whatever they wanted. Nobody held them accountable. So they said, do whatever you want. What do you think happened? We have cake here, cake. Anybody go for the fruit? So you know yourselves very well. You know what you're going to do. So that's what actually happened. So roughly 75% of the men, 88% of the women, they all went for the cake. What conclusion would I draw from that? Is that people are pretty terrible when it comes to predicting the future. We always say, I'm going to start the diet on Monday. This is my last cigarette. Of course, I'm going to call my mother every week. No way. And again, does this happen in the insurance industry? You bet. We had the European Insurance Report that came out this year, and we had this over the last 3 years. So 2 years ago, we asked a set of people, 13,000 people, we asked, do you think buying life insurance is a good idea, and are you planning to do it? 13.4% of the people said yes, it's a good idea, and I will buy it. 2 years later, we looked at the same set of people. Did they buy it or not? Only 5% of the people ended up doing it. So again, we think of products that have maybe some benefit in the future. You have to incur pain right now, and you also deal with something, with the fact that you can't predict your own behavior and you fail to act. So the question is, how do you move people from the place where they know something, they think they should do something, they plan to do it, but then they do nothing in the meantime? How do you combat inaction? So this is, this one I'm going to skip through, but you can see it when we share the slides later. Basically is the list of the 9 most robust kind of mental biases that we know affect behavior. But what we do at Swiss Re is basically we say, okay, so we know that people have all these mental shortcuts when they make choices. They're not very good at predicting their future. Context has a huge impact on what people end up doing. So how can we understand this behavior? We go about understanding this behavior by testing. So far, we've been able to devise about 110 different tests in more than 33 countries. And as I was mentioning earlier, we're focusing on every step of the process. From the moment you interact with your customer and you start asking questions like, are you a smoker, yes or no? How much do you smoke every day? Is it 10 or is it 50? To the point where you start selling something. So where in the customer journey is there some barrier to action? To the point where you deal with renewals and also in the claims process. And usually the way it looks, we sit down with the insurance company and we say, so what is a pain point that you have? What is it that your customers are doing or not doing? What behavior would you like to influence? We do a diagnosis of the process. We design the intervention, and then we observe. And it can take anywhere between like a week, if it's in the digital space, to even 9 months if you have a very low number of customer interactions. So this was the theoretical part, and now I'm going to show some actual examples, because it's still, I bet that it doesn't make completely sense, because it's not the most approachable subject in that sense. So the first example I'm going to share with you is one of my favorites, and is one of the very first ones that we've done. And we know that the insurance industry, people tend to not be completely honest when it comes to lifestyle choices. So when you ask people how much do they weigh, how tall they are, they always fudge the results just a little bit. The same goes to alcohol consumption, smoking, drinking, things like that. When it comes to very serious questions, that doesn't happen so much. So we went back to theory, and we know that roughly, when people have the chance to lie, they do it about 30%, by about 30%. So if you have a test and you solve, I don't know, 10 questions, you're probably going to say you did 13. And this is a really interesting behavior, because we know that people don't lie all the way, even when it makes sense. So if you have a normal distribution with 100 people, a few are extreme liars, a few are extremely honest, but the majority are actually pretty good people, and they only take a little bit, like $3, $4 here, but then they rationalize it because they say, oh, somebody else did this to me a while ago, so I can do it but still feel really good about myself, it's okay. But if you aggregate the results of what the majority of the people do, that's actually quite serious. So we modeled our test after something that an academic in the US did. So he had a bunch of students. They were all going to take a test, and they were all going to be given the chance to cheat. He divided this group in half. Half just went and took the test. Of course, they lied. The other half first had to answer a question, very simple question, which was, can you recall the 10 commandments in the Bible? What do they say? And some of the people were not even religious, but they roughly knew that it's about not cheating, not lying, not stealing, things like that. It had to do with ethics and morality. We said, okay, can we help our client, this Australian client, increase honesty by using this principle? Probably we can't ask the clients about the Bible because there would be issues with the legal department. But what many insurance form or underwriting forms have is this box at the very end which says, I'm going to write my name and all the information I have given is honest and accurate, and you sign it. So we looked at this and we said, well, it's at the bottom. It's not like people are going to sign it and then they're going to say, oh, excuse me, let me go back and change all my answers. So we took it from the bottom, we put it at the top, and then we just watched what happens. And we had a sample of about 4,000 people for a portfolio of about 78,000 people, actually. And when we tracked the results, we saw a 3% difference in the number of people who self-reportedly were taking unprescripted drugs and drinking alcohol over a certain threshold. You can say, well, this is not very much. On the other hand, this is an extremely cheap way of testing. All you have to do is move a box from the bottom to the top. 3% over a portfolio of 78,000 people is about 2,000 people who are now in a completely different category, and you had to do nothing about it. And if you think, when you interact with your customers, you start understanding behavior and incorporating these little tweaks here and there in the way you deal with the context, the impact of what you see as a result can add up and be quite large. So this was an example of the underwriting type of testing that we do. And interestingly, we've replicated this in Australia. We did this in South Africa, very similar results. We did something very similar in Switzerland. I live in Switzerland, and we had zero impact. So this was quite baffling. We're still trying to understand what are the Swiss doing. Ideally, we would like to replicate it again. Next one is from the digital space, which I know is relevant for our topic. And in this case, the insurer came to us and they said, it's renewal time. We're going to send out a bunch of emails to people. And what we want is to get more people to be opening the emails that we're sending. Can you help? We said, OK, let's look at what you're doing. What's your control group? What they were sending out was an email that had this subject line. And it said, it's renewal time. You're going to have a 10% discount on your policy. If you think back of the theory, this is a classic economic incentive. It has to do with money, 10% discount. But again, people are terrible at thinking of percentages in general. And the response rate was pretty good. 33% of the people opened it. But we said, we can make this better. So we decided to try two things. One, we were going to use the concept of ego. So when we look at this bias, it basically says that people like to feel special. They like to feel privileged. We said, if we include a message like this, maybe this will help. The second one that we tested was the idea of personalizing. So giving information that is very, very personal to the person you're contacting. Which one do you think worked better, ego or bias or personalization? Ego. How many think it's ego? Okay, how many think it was the personal approach? Okay, ego is winning. That's what we thought as well, so that's exactly what we tested. So the email we sent out said, renew your motor policy today at a privileged rate. And you can see a 9 percentage point increase in the number of people who opened up the email. That's pretty good, because again, all you have to do is write a new subject line, very cheap, very quick, great result. However, when we tried the personalized approach, we actually saw a 48% increase, 48 percentage point increase in the number of people who opened up the email. And this was really interesting to us because it did require the ability to really track the customer and pick the information that was relevant to them. And what this said was, basically, this is your license plate and the expiry date is on this particular day. We've replicated this test again, and we see that personalization works very, very well in most of the cases. However, much of the time, our clients are not quite able to do this personalization. And in that case, we always say, well, there's always ego. You still get a pretty good response with that. The next one, this was a very unusual test, and it was from the claims space. So this insurer came to us and they said, we receive quite a number of claims where we know that they are valid and we would like to pay them. But the holdup in our process is the doctors. We're sending this letter and we're asking them to confirm that indeed this patient has the condition that they're saying they have. Can you help us? Because this takes more than 30 days sometimes and people are complaining. So we looked at this, and it was quite a thorny one, and we were dealing with two different conditions. One was critical illness, the other one was terminal illness. So we looked at the letter that were sent to the doctors, and we used two very different approaches. So for critical illness, we used a bias called anchoring. The way this bias works is that if you give people a number, usually they tend to stick around that number as an anchor, just like when you have a boat and you throw the anchor at the bottom. And the same concept in negotiation. If I start low, then I get a response around that number. If I start high, the same thing. So we analyzed the process, and we saw that the fastest doctors only took about 3 days to get back. So that's exactly what we said in the letter. We included this green text, and we said, did you know that the fastest doctors take only 3 days to get back to us? Could you please do the same? That was all we wrote. For the second one, when it came to terminal illness, we decided to take a much more sentimental or emotional approach, and this is the idea of effect, emotional effect. So we literally found some post-it notes and did a handwritten message that was stuck on the letter, and then the letter would be sent to the doctor. And what this message said was, your patient may have as little as 12 months to live. Please do not delay this process. And then we sent out these letters and we tracked the results. And what we saw was when it came to critical illness, so the one with the green text with the 3 days, we saw a 10% statistically significant increase in the number of people who responded within the 30-day period. When it came to the terminal illness one, we saw a 9 percentage point increase in the number of doctors who would respond within 10 days. The insurance company was very, very pleased with these results, and they said that in terms of their satisfaction and their image, this made a huge impact. And again, we're doing very similar tests in claims, but also in the underwriting process, because in some countries, we know that when you gather the information, you also have to get some inputs from the doctors, and that also tends to, again, take a pretty long time. Now I'm going to go through 2 more examples. I think we're still good. Yeah. So, and this was again a digital space test that we did, and it was with the Japanese insurer. So they were already pretty good at understanding their customers. And they came to us and they said, so we have this web page and people are clicking on in different places on it. And what we know is that when people ask to receive a pamphlet or a brochure to their home, they tend to afterwards purchase more of the products. So what we want is to get more people to request this pamphlet to be sent to their home. Can you help us? And with this insurer, we did about 13 or 15 different tests in different places on their webpage, and this is just one of them, so the one with the pamphlet. When we looked at the page, it initially looked like this. So you would go to it, and it had 2 buttons, so you could do 2 things. Either you would get a quote, or you would request a pamphlet. And what we decided to do was to make a very, very subtle change. So we slightly changed the messages to say, if you know how much cover you need, then get a quote. If you're not sure how much cover you need, then you should request a pamphlet. Very, very simple. This was all in Japanese, and actually, although you see the different length here, it all looked about the same. At least we trust that they really did what we said. And then again, we made the slide change, we tracked the results, and this is what it looked like. So very importantly, the number of people who would request the quote stayed the same. That's very important because you don't want to move these people to anywhere else. They were already doing the most important thing. But the desired action was to get more people to request the pamphlet. And what we saw is that the number of people who started requesting a pamphlet as a result doubled. And with this insurer, it's very interesting because this is one of several interventions that we've done on their webpage. So on every step of the journey, we looked, where is it that you would like to tweak things? And we saw a doubling here, an increase there, and overall, all these small changes started adding up quite quickly for them in the sense and how they interact with their customers. And the last example I'm going to show is paper-based, and this is one of the most often type of testing that we do. We thought we would do much more digital, but actually we do quite a bit of paper-based still. And I think someone was talking about the fact that in the insurance industry, we still use quite a bit of jargon and insurance language, and sometimes we tend to forget a little bit that the people who receive these letters don't deal with insurance all the time, and they're just people on the street. So this insurer came to us and they said, we're going to send out a bunch of letters to people. And these are renewal letters, and there's also a 20% price increase, and we're very worried that people are going to start lapsing in a very high percentage. Can you help us at all? So we said, okay, show us the letter that you're planning to send. So we looked at it, and what we saw was a couple of things. The letter was pretty long. The main point didn't come until the very end of the letter, so by then some people probably would stop reading. And most importantly, the language that was being used in the letter was quite negative and apologetic. And in behavioral science, this speaks to the concept of framing. So people respond to certain words or cues. So if you tend to speak negatively to someone, they're likely to respond with you in the same way. If you start framing things in a more positive manner, then people are also likely to respond to you in a similar fashion. So we did 2 things to this letter. First, we cut the text in half, and we made the language around it much more simplistic. And we also started using a much more positive message. So whereas the original said, we're really sorry that there's this price increase and please don't leave us, the second letter said, we're delighted to offer you this policy, and yes, there's a 20% increase, but the good news is that you can still stay with us. And we got to the point, we acknowledged the 20% price increase, and we didn't make that big of a deal out of it, right? And again, when we started tracking the results for this one, we saw that there was a full 3 percentage point difference between the 2 letters. So again, you can say, well, 3 percentage points, but we know that in the insurance industry, that's quite difficult to achieve. And this insurer has been very, very pleased with this approach for their letters. So they've been using this letter and a bunch of similar ones since August last year, and they see consistent results on that. So with that, I come to the end of my examples. If there's a point I would like to conclude with is that if you have any pain points, behavioral science can offer many different solutions for many different problems, and we strongly believe that the key to better understanding customer behavior is through rigorous testing and then understanding how to apply the insights that you derive about your customers into the way you approach them in the future. Thank you very much.